So here I'm loosening the screws on the reservoir cap. And I'm breaking the tension of the cap with a soft rubber mallet. I was originally doing this video to bleed brakes, but after the initial inspection I can see that the brake fluid has not been looked after at all. So I reinstall the cap because further work is needed. I then loosen the brake caliper from its mount. I then break the banjo bolt seal from the caliper. And drain the fluid into a container. I then inspect the banjo bolt and notice considerable build-up on the inside. I then remove the slide bolts for the brake pads and remove the pads. I then remove the pistons from the brake caliper using circlip pliers on the inside of the piston so as to not damage them. Then using a small flat blade screwdriver, I remove the seals from the caliper. I then remove the mirror from the master cylinder reservoir. And remove the master cylinder assembly and reservoir. I then take off the lever and remove the boot from the master cylinder's piston. There is a snap ring holding the piston in place, which I remove with a different set of circlip pliers. I then remove the circlip, the piston and the spring from inside the master cylinder. I then remove the other banjo bolt and re-inspect the reservoir, which as you can see is incredibly bad. I then take the seals off the master cylinder piston and I clean all the components bar the seals in warm soapy water with a toothbrush. After that, I clean them using brake cleaner and emery paper on the surfaces. I also use compressed air. As you can see, there's a big difference between this and how it used to look. I then reinstall the caliper seals into the caliper, and to do this I lubricate them with brake fluid. I also lubricate the inside of the caliper with brake fluid. I then lubricate the pistons and insert them into the caliper. I lubricate the seals and insert them onto the master cylinder's piston. I lubricate the piston and seals with brake fluid again and insert it into the master cylinder assembly. And I put it into place with the snap ring. I then put the dust boot back into place. I then grease the lever and install it onto the master cylinder assembly after putting it back on the bike. And reinstall the banjo bolt to the master cylinder and the brake hose. I then install the brake pads back on the caliper. And lubricate the slides for the caliper mount and the caliper with grease. And then reassemble. As you can see, the slides are working. I then put the caliper back on the bike. And test the slide. I then install the hose and the banjo bolt into the caliper. And fill the reservoir up with .4 brake fluid, which is recommended for this system. I then bleed the brakes from the lower end using an air compressor system. And I continue to tap on the brake line and pull the lever in to get the air out of the system, as well as bleeding it with the compressor. This takes a few times, and I continue to fill up the reservoir before it gets too low. Once from the bottom I can see a consistent stream of fluid without air. I know it's ready. And I can install the cap onto the reservoir. In case of any overflow, when I put the cap on, I put a rag around the reservoir so that the brake fluid won't go onto any of the bodywork because it can damage it. A nice little trick I learned is also to tie down the brake lever so that it's an open system so that any air whilst you're working on other parts of the motorcycle can work its way through the system. I then clean the reservoir and the caliper with soap and water to wash away any brake fluid that might be left on the components. And this is just to show you that after the rebuild of the braking system, the caliper and the master cylinder is operational in grabbing the disc rotor and releasing it as well. Hi, it's Jim here about the brake system overhaul on the Hyosung. I just want to quickly point out that this is a demonstration bike, and that's why I didn't use new parts, new seals and that sort of thing, but I would have without a doubt recommended to the customer pretty much insisted that given the state of the braking system on this bike, that new seals in the master cylinder be replaced on the piston, as well as a new spring. I would have also recommended that a new brake hose be installed because the old one was a bit hard and it could crack. I'd also recommend that the washers on the banjo bolt be replaced, and also the seals on the brake caliper system itself, as well as the pistons for the brake caliper, because they were a bit worn and had a few scuff marks and just didn't look all that great. And of course I would have recommended new brake pads, because the brake pads themselves, I think at some point that piston had seized and grabbed that disc rotor, and the brake pads were in really bad nick. And there was actually a lot of pad left on it, but the backing plate was pretty badly corroded and just didn't look real good. So I would have recommended they be replaced as well. So basically a pretty significant overhaul of the master cylinder system and the brake caliper system would have been installed for this bike, because I've been around bikes a while, but I've never seen brake fluid that bad. It was pretty rough. But it is operational now. But again, if this was a customer's bike with braking system, I wouldn't have left any room for error, and I would have recommended those parts be replaced.